Class of '09 is a slice-of-life visual novel where you play as a girl trying to get through high school, a pretty typical premise. It's also one of the darkest games I have ever played. It's pretty rare for a game to cover just one of rape, suicide, pedophilia, or school shootings, but Class of '09 manages to do all the above and more. So, content warning, I guess. It's a short game that only requires a few hours to get all the endings for, but the pace and density of some of the worst things that could possibly happen in life is unrelenting. And importantly, there are no truly happy endings, no possible avenues of escape. Every ending includes varying degrees of misery, and they tend to go towards the really fucking miserable side. On a first playthrough, you can have the main character, Nicole, go to her gym class, and the gym teacher will walk in on her while she's changing and hit on her. That's bad enough, but it can be followed up with him taking her out on a date, bringing her home, and murdering her. And this all happens within a span of like 10 minutes of playtime. And that's one of the main endings of the game. It's perfectly reasonable if you just want to stop right there and not play anymore. You beat the game after all. But that won't do. I paid money for this game. I want to experience all the content it has to offer. This is obviously a healthy relationship to have with art, so let's try to get all the endings. The obvious course of action is to play the game again and kindly reject all the creepy guys who try to hit on you. Obviously, these are late 2000s teenage boys, so they'll be disappointed by your rejection, but respect the decision without taking it personally. Just kidding, they call you a slut anyway and cause rumors so bad you get bullied until suicide. Alright, well this time fuck everyone else, let's be a mean girl. Don't take anyone else's emotions into consideration, make your boundaries clear, and take a stand against anyone who doesn't respect them. And well, now things actually kinda sort out. Suddenly, Nicole can get through all the horrors of her life with her psyche intact. Well, sometimes. You can also get randomly shot, but that's just how America is sometimes. So the question is, what do these choices and endings say about the game as a piece of art? To solve this, I want to talk about procedural rhetoric. Procedural rhetoric is a pretty common term in the field of game studies, but it's somehow eluded the grasp of popular games criticism, unlike, say, ludonarrative dissonance or... Actually, I think it's only ludonarrative dissonance. People really love that shit for some reason. Procedural rhetoric is a term that generally describes the ways that rule sets and mechanics of a game can convey messages and rhetoric. It's not a super specific term, but that allows it to be very useful in a variety of different types of analyses. For example, if a game's system shows that misogyny is so widespread that it appears in every possible playthrough, and that the only positive endings you can get require acting disobedient and unempathetic, that game structure means something. Procedural rhetoric forces you to consider that this is how the mechanisms of the world might work, that there is no escape for a kind Nicole, and any choice she makes is going to result in extremely edgy misery, probably towards her. Therefore, a possible interpretation of Class of '09 is as arguing that the only way to effectively deal with the overwhelming sexism of the world is to be a bit of an asshole. But that might not be rhetorically convincing. One of the problems with procedural rhetoric as a theoretical method is that most people don't often interpret media in such a straightforward way. It's pretty common to find a reader who sees a very blatantly evil act done in an off-putting way in a piece of media, which should rhetorically argue that an act is bad, who feels that this depiction is unrealistic, so the rhetoric doesn't affect them in the intended way. Probably because they haven't experienced anything close to that happening to them. But in real life, sometimes unrealistic events happen. People often act in ways that seem strange and unnatural. Something like The Room is criticized oftentimes for being unrealistic, but Tommy Wiseau is a real guy, and he actually acts like this.
The realism is better. They make it just fun of it. You know, some people, everybody can do it. It's easy to do. Oh, you did a bad job. Everything's bad. You know what I'm saying?
Something that can actually happen in real life might feel unrealistic in a piece of media. And in the case of Class of '09, sometimes an authority figure will outright say they're a pedophile, ask a child on a date, and nobody will believe them. Which might be connected to why some might not find it believable in a piece of media. And that's disappointing. The general events in the game feel very realistic to me, and I wouldn't be surprised if the writing was based on people's real experiences in high school as implied in-game. But importantly, Class of '09 doesn't even try to make it seem realistic. Despite all the dark scenes in the game, it's a comedy.
I've been here for a year and never once heard of someone having sex with you.
I've been here since 3rd grade and haven't heard it.
Nuh-uh. Remember freshman year with Jenny Fillmore?
She was unconscious. How do you still brag about that?
You're like the reason they have women's college.
It's the second funniest game I have ever played. These scenes are exaggerated in a way that might not be realistic, but are very funny. It is a campy dark comedy. Now, I just used the word camp, which might be a little contentious. The idea of camp has been blurred over the years, with its academic origins from Susan Sontag's notes on camp. She agrees that camp is an exaggerated and artificial style in art, which is how most people define it, but there's a few important differences from its popular use today. In her definition, camp should come from a failed intent of serious art. It was deeply tied to queer culture and history. And this doesn't really apply to Class of '09. While intent can be hard to figure out, the tone seems very intentional. And while a queer reading is certainly possible, I'd say it feels aggressively heterosexual. Instead, I'll be using the TV tropes definition. A sensibility that revels in artifice, stylization, theatricality, irony, playfulness, and exaggeration rather than content. While TV tropes has not been exactly good for pop cultural analysis and media, I think that this definition gets at the essence of camp, or at least the parts that I think are important. Camp encourages a certain kind of reader response, where you're still invested in the narrative, but detached from the usual intended sentiments. This isn't a style that most dark comedies about teen girls tend to have. Usually, the dark and the comedy are separated. The comedy isn't really connected to the darkness, but works in spite of it. For example, Heathers is a very campy film, but the camp is relegated to more neutral scenes, with shifts in tone so the violence is taken seriously. In Welcome to the Dollhouse, the main character handles dark situations in very awkward ways, with the tone of a more standard cringe comedy. But I'm a Cheerleader is probably the campiest film in the genre that I've seen, but even it goes to great lengths to tone down the darkness, with a depiction of gay conversion camps that is much less horrifying than it is in real life. None of these are the tone I get from Class of '09. The tone remains both dark and comedic throughout the entire game, which can potentially change the way the narrative's meaning is interpreted. The campy tone of the game means that you probably won't take the procedural rhetoric seriously. You're not thinking about the game's mechanics or the systems, you're thinking more about the comedy and how funny it is. Instead, it's a kind of playful rhetoric, understanding the arguments given by the game's structure, but not thinking about it as an accurate simulation of the real world. This lets Class of '09's depiction of sexism resist a not all men reader response. This playful rhetoric doesn't argue that every interaction with a male figure will result in a terrible experience that can't be avoided. Instead, it gives the feeling that a terrible experience might happen with every interaction involving a male figure. This sense, along with the alienation that the campy tone brings, informs the worldview of our main character, Nicole. Despite all the horrible things that are happening to people around her, she doesn't give a shit about any of them. That's because Nicole is explicitly a sociopath. It's one of the first things that we learn about her, set up in the introductory cinematic. This is an explicit pathologization of a lack of empathy. I hope that line was insightful because it took me like 20 takes to say the P word correctly. Nicole does not care about any of these ridiculous, campy characters, and neither should we. Class of '09 encourages an unempathetic reading of an unempathetic character. That's a pretty rare route for a piece of art to take. I'm willing to bet that if pressed, 9 out of 10 people who study art, but not the philosophy of art, would see that the value of art is the ability to produce empathy for other people. In a world where everything that requires material or labor to be made needs justification, art can only have value if it somehow produces a better society. Under this mindset, aesthetics can't have value on their own. So they appeal to a practical argument that just doesn't seem to be true. But that doesn't mean the claim is necessarily false. The book Engagement in the City, How Arts and Culture Impact Development in Urban Areas performs a literature review on dozens of studies attempting to find if art can increase empathy for the good of society. And there just doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence one way or the other. Take that, Roger Ebert. But for the sake of argument, let's say that art can make you a more empathetic person. That good art makes us better understand and care about our fellow human beings. Well, in that case, fuck that. I don't want good art. I don't want to be a better person. I want to get actively worse. Don't be empathetic. Kill everyone now. Condone first-degree murder. Advocate cannibalism. And eat shit. Okay, maybe not that far. This may seem like a pretty ridiculous argument to make, but empathy isn't that important. Empathy is a very commonly held virtue, and it can seem absurd or disingenuous to actively take a stance against it. It's even the basis for a major ethical system called care ethics. But hear me out. As Zhan Yao argues in their book Disaffected, An ethics of empathy does more to serve those in power than it does to serve the marginalized. When we create an ethics based on empathy, and when we choose who to empathize with based on cultural values, who is excluded? Racial minorities, queer people, the disabled, and people like Nicole. She is a loud, cruel, sociopathic affect alien, and that can be a bit off-putting. It is a lot harder for most people to empathize with someone like Nicole. And when faced with this marginalization, a powerful defense is to be disaffected, to avoid caring about other people, to use a state of unfeeling for yourself. This is where the subversive potential of disaffection lies. If you're in a position where you can be unempathetic, you can resist the power structures that care reinforces. In their book, Yao gives the example of white women doctors in the modern era. Women who were able to work within the cold and professional modern clinic were in a position that encouraged disaffection in order to do difficult medical work. This disaffected state allowed for a gender nonconformity in a culture that expected women to be caring and obedient, while the white female doctor didn't have the same expectations, or at least not to the same extent. The men saw these women as masculine and unfit for marriage, which, while exclusionary, allowed for expanded gender expression which wasn't possible before. This subject position produced the possibility for queerness, especially for asexual, aromantic, or sapphic women. In this situation, can we really say that a lack of empathy implies a lack of moral character? When we cannot enter into her indifference and insensibility, as in the case of people who do not react to insult or injury, such people are seen as contemptible and just as bad as their aggressor. As we critique the liberal politics of recognition and inclusion, can we address the necessity of the antisocial and exclusionary moves by the marginalized? To notice how we are moved or not moved by others, structured by the governmentality of aesthetics and representation. Perhaps the field of politics itself must change in the face of the incompatible, inconsistent, and stubbornly uninstrumentizable. Acknowledge rather than disavow your negative feelings about the unsympathetic refusals. Nicole takes this idea to its most extreme degree. She's a sociopath. She is literally unable to empathize by definition. But as Nicole sees it, a lack of empathy is less of a personality trait and more of a strategy to navigate social relations.
I figured out that if you just don't engage with other people's emotions or desires, nothing's a burden.
Excuse me?
Like, I'll put it like this. Anytime a guy asks for my company, asks me out, asks for anything, and I make decisions entirely for myself, not concerned with their feelings, there's no stress. The main concept is girls removing all emotional attachment from anyone.
It also inverts the idea of an empathy-based ethics with the depiction of the classic bullying tactic of being really nice to the weird kid because it'd be funny if they don't realize. And if you're thinking to yourself, does that actually happen? I'm sorry to tell you this, but you were that weird kid. This unempathetic stance is what makes Class of 09 so effective in its portrayal of boundary drawing. Just 2 months before Class of 09, another indie game about turning people down was released. Say No More. Very cute, clever title for a very cute, clever game. The object of the game is to, say no to people who make demands from you. I swear it's more interesting than it sounds. It's a decent game. But it's also a very empathetic game. Say No More's portrayal of rejection is very sentimental. When you tell someone no, they'll be disappointed, but they'll eventually recognize that you did the right thing in expressing your boundaries. Empathy is shared with everyone, and rejection will make everyone happier in the end.
So, about the rent. Can you pay for it this month?
No.
No. But what? Are you serious? So you're just gonna throw me out the window like this? Bye. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I shouted at you and that wasn't cool and... Thank you. For saying that word. And I appreciate your honesty and your support.
Very cute, very wholesome, very heckin' pupper? Whatever, I don't know. This sentimental depiction of rejection can ring just a bit hollow when compared to Class of 09.
Nicole, I know I called you a whore like 2 minutes ago, but could you let me go with you just this once?
No, fuck off.
Fine, be a bitch, see if I care.
Rejection can be a messy thing that can require disaffection in order to get by. The expectation for women to be empathetic can be actively harmful to them, and Class of '09 helps to show this idea using its unique tone and structure. It is a fascinating defense of an unempathetic life and of unempathetic art. Except there's a sequel, and this one isn't quite as defensive of Nicole.
Yeah, there's something I've been wanting to say lately.
Oh, what's that?
The N-word.
Why would you want to say that?
Class of '09 The Re-Up was released about 2 years after the first, and there's a lot of similarities between them. It has the same characters, the same UI, and the same darkly comedic tone. Remember when I said that Class of '09 is the second funniest game I've ever played? Well, the sequel has it beat.
And so, that's why I wasn't super broken up when my wife killed herself. Any questions? Jeffrey.
Yeah, what's our science lab gonna be about today?
I meant questions about my wife killing herself.
Oh, sorry, no.
But despite these similarities, it does differ from the first in a few important ways. It's more focused on the times that Nicole hurts people in ways that aren't deserving or necessary, especially against other girls. This is most apparent during the route where Nicole dates the only lesbian girl in school and abuses her throughout the entire relationship, especially during the conversation after they break up.
Explain to me how this is any more awful than anything I usually do.
Because usually you do it to men. I'm like, was that overboard? And you always say,
He'll end up a rapist or pedophile anyway.
but she's a teenage girl, Nicole. She is a gay, codependent teenage girl, as if it wasn't hard enough. What's your excuse this time?
This section shows the real way that many strategies that girls use to defend themselves against others also end up hurting the girls that are around them, especially the more marginalized girls in their life. The sequel also shows some re-examination about the way that Nicole treats men as well. A lot of it is still unleashing fury against creeps, but it's not always so deserving like the first game. She tries to ruin one boy's relationship to get back at his girlfriend, and he seems nice enough.
So far, I got 11 pictures of his dick so far.
God damn, he's desperate.
Okay, maybe not super nice, but he seemed innocent before this. And in one route, Nicole starts to sell drugs to make money. She isn't being forced to sell drugs, and she's not even in a Breaking Bad situation. She's a middle-class white girl being a piece of shit, and the game knows it.
It's get rich or die trying. I did what I had to.
You're white.
What?
You're white, Nicole. You didn't have to do anything.
That's what you think.
What I know is we live in cul-de-sacs, and you don't have to sell crack when you live in a cul-de-sac.
I didn't even totally mean financially. Like, my parents were mean to me and shit. It, makes you make bad decisions.
You sold crack to a pregnant woman because your mom was mean to you?
Yeah, sorta.
There's no longer any procedural rhetoric produced through the game's choices. You're not choosing between accepting and rejecting other people's proposals, but instead choosing, what kind of asshole do you want Nicole to be this time? There's a pretty clear tension between this and the themes of the first game, right? A defensive disaffection versus maybe being unempathetic isn't always good. They're not contradictory, but they do work against each other just a little. Edgy anti-hero media usually have themes that can have a similar tension. Is Travis Bickle a product of loneliness in an alienating culture? Or is he an active agent who's a threat to society? Is the Joker rebelling against an ableist capitalist system? Or is he literally the Joker? And defense? Well, he starts killing people because traffic is annoying, or something. When analyzing these kinds of stories, there's a general conflict between the idea that people are forced to be bad in an unjust society, and that bad people produce an unjust society. These ideas are made separate in the two Class of '09 games. The first game expresses the former, and the sequel expresses the latter. They easily could have been two different games, but there's a bounding effect with their themes, where these ideas can be made and conveyed separately. So is disaffection a legitimate method to survive a misogynistic culture? Or can this lack of empathy hurt the innocent? Turns out, it can be both. Sexist social systems can both force girls to be mean for survival while hurting their other relationships. And those tendencies can be a bad and unnecessary moral choice. And together, it complicates the idea of empathy as a purely positive or negative force. And I find that a really interesting route for Class of '09 to take. A lot of games try to have a very clear and straightforward message, but Class of '09 is more complicated, and it deserves your thought and attention.